G'day, how are you? Have you ever wondered about this meter here? It shows up in your camera. It's actually the light meter, or can be used to adjust your exposure compensation, or also to dial in your automatic exposure bracketing settings. But for now, we're going to be looking at the light meter and exposure compensation side of it. Did you know that this meter here behaves differently depending on what mode you're shooting in? For instance, if you're shooting in one of the automatic modes like shutter priority or aperture priority or P or anything that has auto settings applied, this allows you to adjust the exposure compensation. Well, what is exposure compensation? It essentially allows you to override the exposure settings picked by your camera in that automatic mode. So your camera is trying to take an exposure using what it knows about good exposure. I think it's 18% grey. And then it gives you the option on the screen to either make that image brighter by dialing in a positive value or make that image darker by dialing in a negative value. What it effectively does is it actions upon the variables that are able to be changed within that mode. By example, if you're in aperture priority mode and you use the exposure compensation meter to dial down a negative value, it can't change the aperture because that's locked in accordance with that mode. So what it will do is it will firstly look to the ISO to see if that's on auto setting. If so, adjust that, and if it's not, then it will go to the shutter and it will adjust the shutter speed to adjust the exposure you're going to get in your final image. That's how it works in a nutshell. Now flip it on its head, and if you're in shutter priority mode, of course, it can't affect the shutter part of the equation, so it'll reach out again to the ISO. If that's auto, it'll adjust that. If that's not auto, if the ISO is locked in, it won't adjust it, and then it will look to the aperture to make the change in value. Exposure compensation is really great to be able to use in situations where your camera may be overexposing the scene or underexposing it based on the metering. Of course, you can also use it for a little bit of artistic input into your shooting when you are using one of the automatic modes. For instance, maybe you want to expose a little to the right so you can dial it up to the right. Maybe you want a slightly darker, moodier image so you can dial down a negative value, and you've got it. Okay, the thing that can be confusing though is that if you were to jump into manual mode, all of a sudden this meter here is not used for exposure compensation. Well, that is to say, unless you have your ISO on auto, because then that value is still able to be manipulated by the camera. So exposure compensation may work in that situation. But anyway, once you come to this meter in manual mode, what it's actually giving you is a light meter reading. So if you look at this and you half press to focus or use your back button focus, whichever your choice, and you notice that you'll see where the line pops up in the meter, this is telling you where your settings have landed the exposure in comparison to what the camera believes is the ideal exposure in that situation. Okay, so you get it? Basically, if you look at this and say for instance there might be an arrow to the left, it means you're way dark, so you have to slow down your shutter speed, or open up your aperture, or increase your ISO. If you have a little arrow or a triangle pointing to the right, it means you're way too bright, so you have to speed up your shutter speed or stop down your lens or otherwise reduce some of that ISO to bring the exposure down. And what you do is you use this here, you can see when you're coming into the point that the camera believes it's going to be the ideal exposure for the situation. And using this in manual mode allows you to set your settings according to the exposure that your camera sees without even taking a photo. And then, hey, you can always remember those settings and then flick back to one of the automatic modes to lock those in. This meter also does show up in another place to set automatic exposure bracketing settings, but it's very logical in that application. The thing that can be tricky, and why I'm doing this clip, is transitioning from one of the automatic shooting modes to the manual mode, how the function of that meter fundamentally changes. We're still targeting that center point where the camera believes the best exposure is going to be. It's just in a manual mode, you manipulate that meter with your settings. Whereas in the automatic modes, you're manipulating the settings with that meter. I think that sums it up. Thanks a lot for watching. If you've got any questions, ask below. Otherwise, as always, have a good one, and we'll catch you next time. Bye.